Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the second CBCS seminar this week. First of all, to start with the country acknowledgement, the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianships of the lands on which we meet today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to the country. We recognize their valuable contribution to Australian and global society. Now, to introduce our speaker for today's talk, it is my pleasure to introduce Sohini Dudhat, who is a PhD student at University of St. Andrews in Scotland. She has a background in ecology and marine biology, and she has previously worked as a research fellow at Wildlife Institute of India, a federal research institute under the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change in India, and where she has contributed majorly to the Dugong Conservation Project, that is an ongoing project, and marine protected area assessments along the west coast of India. Today, she will be presenting her work on marine megafauna strandings in the Indian Ocean region. So, welcome and thank you for taking out your time.
Thank you for the introduction, Sharat, and thank you to you and CBCS who have me here. So I'll be talking about my work over the past few years in India and Oman. So to start with, so as Sharat mentioned, prior to my PhD, I was working in India. I worked for seagrass meadow characterization for dugongs in the Andaman Islands in India. After that, I was doing a biodiversity assessment for corals and fish fauna on the west coast of India in an MPA. During the same time, I started working on this marine mammal strandings along the entire coast of India. So that's something I'm going to be presenting now. So to take you to my study site, this is a part of the northern Indian Ocean. My area of interest is the Arabian Sea, and I've worked in India and Oman, which fall on the either side of Arabian Sea. So the uniqueness of this region is because of the monsoonal winds. So during the months of June to September, the winds move towards the Indian subcontinent, setting into motion upwelling in Oman and Yemen, that region. And during the months of November and December, the monsoon returns. The northeasterly winds are towards Oman. So this is an important factor which will come into play later as I talk about things. But my main theme for today's work is that I have access to the historical long-term databases on strandings from both these countries, and how we can use that data to prioritize future conservation action in these regions. So to start with, strandings can be defined as marine animals ending up on the shore without being able to get back into the sea on their own. Strandings can be live or dead animals. My area of focus is dead animals. And so to start with the process, what we find on the beach is kind of the end of the jigsaw puzzle. Before this, there are a few processes which sets this thing into motion. So the first thing is, like, when we talk about how does this animal end up here, the first thing is presence of the animals. The marine mammal species could be residential or migratory, depending on their abundances, how much of them are there, and what are the threats to their population. How many of them end up dead changes, obviously. The second factor is these populations are under threat due to many natural and human-induced causes in the ocean. Ship strikes, diseases, and entanglement in fisheries, nets and gears, to name a few. And the third thing is when the animal dies, two things can happen. It starts decomposing, and if it's in the deeper oceans, it's likely to sink to the seabed or get drifted when it bloats up due to decomposition. It can get drifted because of wind and ocean currents and ends up on the beach. So stranding is basically a complex interplay of these factors: the biology, mortality, drift, and if it's detected by humans or it's lost at the sea. So ideally, if I have all the pieces of the puzzle, my life would be much easier, but we don't live in an ideal world. And this is what I have from these countries. So we have a good idea about which species are present in our oceans, whether they are residential or they are migratory. We don't have much information about their abundances from the past or the present yet. We have a general idea about what threats are to the species in our oceans. Um, like assigning the cause of mortality for a stranding is very difficult if the animal is really decomposed or in any state. So that's not what I'm going to be dealing with. The animals that we found are definitely floating and drifting to the currents because I'm not surveying the seabeds at all. And these are the records. So most of the data which I have is from opportunistic records from the people who have local residents or researchers working in the region. Like I said, necropsies were not always performed, so we don't have a very good idea about the causes of death in each of these factors. But I'm going to talk about how we can use this information for future conservation action. To start with India, opportunist records for strandings have been collected as long as back as 1748. But the stranding network started only in 2008, which is called the Marine Mammal Research and Conservation Network of India. The strandings which are reported there are still opportunistic listings from entire coastline. Necropsies are being performed only in recent years and are restricted only to some areas. So I pulled in the records from publications, grey literature, reports, and ongoing projects, open access databases to analyze the spatial and temporal trends for these. I found 33 species of marine mammals which are standard. 32 are cetaceans, and there's one Sirenian dugong found. The records after 1975 were more consistent. So my study period for the study is 1975 to 2017. The decadal trends show that there was there was a definite increase in the number of strandings in the recent years, especially between 2015 to 17. These records, there was a lot of debate about how much of these species are correctly identified. So I decided to club them into taxonomical groups, baleen whales, sperm and beak whales, dolphins, and dugongs. The biodiversity and the ocean conditions on the east and west coast of India are quite different. So I have compared the two coastlines over here. Over the years, we found there was a definite increase in the number of baleen whale strandings on the west coast. And there was also an increase during the monsoonal period, that is between June to August. The strandings of sperm and beak whales were very less in number, so there were no patterns that we could detect. Similar to the baleen whales, the dolphin and porpoise strandings also went higher on the west coast after 2010. There was also the pattern with the monsoonal winds that there were increased strandings on the west coast during June to September. And also on the east coast, there was a higher number of strandings during the months of December and January. Similarly, for dugongs, there was on the east coast a higher number of strandings like during the winter months. The dugong population on the west coast is really small, so we didn't really detect any trends over there. So to understand the spatial variations, I first plotted this map, which did not really increase my understanding. This is quite complex with all the species. So I'm going to show you evolution of some maps using some tools that I found. I divided the coast of mainland India into 50-kilometer sections and assigned the number of strandings to those sections. We found that there are some regions which have a higher stranding intensity than other parts of the country. The west coast, as compared to the east coast, has moderate to high number of strandings. And there are some blank patches over here on the east coast. And most of the strandings are concentrated towards this region, which has the highest intensity of strandings. I used a tool called emerging hotspot analysis. which, using the man-kindle statistics, combines the temporal and spatial aspects of the data. So these bins are of 50-kilometer length, and it combines how across the years these regions have changed. For example, it gives out 8 hot or cold spot patterns. From my data, I found 4 of them. So these regions had higher number of strandings in the recent time step, which is 2016 to 17. These regions were consecutive hotspots. That means that the strandings were significantly higher after 2010, like in the last decade. And these regions are sporadic hotspots, which mean that there were a lot of strandings, but they were a hotspot on and off across the study period. So a tool like this can help us prioritize where to focus our conservation action in, because this is a country of 7,500 kilometers. So a tool like this can help us focus our efforts in the region where you need it the most. So to conclude, the average stranding rate in India has increased threefold in the recent years, which is concerning. And it's also a factor of increased reporting with the stranding network and other things, in combination to the increase in anthropogenic pressures in the near coastal regions. There were higher strandings in June to September on the west coast and in November to December on the east coast. And like I said, tools like emerging hotspot analysis can help us prioritize regions for conservation action. This study is published now. You can read it over here. So this concludes the first part of my work. But what challenges I faced during this work was, first was reporting bias. Since most of these are opportunistic data, that can really influence the kind of results I get. And the second is spatial scale bias. I selected 50-kilometer as my spatial scale, but there might be factors influencing things at a larger scale, which I haven't explored for this study at least. So going ahead, what I wanted to do with this study was understand the changes according to the seasons and to assess what impact monsoonal currents play in deposition of carcasses. I would like to know what the causes of strandings are and what the threats to the populations are, and if it is linked to the anthropogenic activity like fisheries or shipping traffic in the region. This brings me to start my PhD in Oman in 2022, which is right across the coast of Arabian Sea, and the research on cetaceans has been going on since 1989. There were some dedicated surveys for strandings as in combination to the opportunistic data from this region. And so the initial data exploration looked something like this. We found that this region had more strandings as compared to the other parts. And we found that in certain years, the stranding numbers were really high, and also in certain seasons, like the winter months. But this again started pointing towards reporting bias, because I thought that I knew for sure that in these years there were more surveys happening, and these are the months when people are out more, and it's more likely to detect stranded animals here. So to deal with the reporting bias, we decided to select some frequently stranded species and use them as a proxy. So for example, we calculated proportions of these species as compared to the other strandings to see if anyone was at the beach at all, what was the probability of sighting these species over the years. I also carried out some GLMs to understand the seasonal variations. So I found 20 species of cetaceans stranded throughout the study period. Small cetaceans or dolphins were the most numerous, and among them, Susa plumbea, Tursiops, and Delphinus made up for the 50% of the records. So I selected these species to understand how their trends changed over the years. For humpback dolphins, we saw a definite decline in the proportion of strandings over the decades. This is a coastal species which does not migrate or move ahead. It stays the average preferred depth is 25 meters. This is also endangered because of the near coast activity like fisheries. So if the strandings are going down, it could probably mean that the population is also going down. This is also backed up by the sighting surveys which were happening, the offshore surveys which were happening by the season. They have been seeing lesser of humpback dolphins in the region. For bottlenose dolphins, again, we saw that in the last decade, there were fewer stranded animals. And for common dolphins, we saw a trend in which in the last decade, we saw that this animal has not been confidently identified as common dolphin because there was a change in the way data was recorded. And this species, because it's morphologically similar to Stenella or spinner dolphin, could be easily confused with it. So we are urging the on-ground teams to, first of all, not have these kinds of mistakes because that kind of obscures our understanding of the topic. And going ahead, we found that there were the higher proportion of Sousa strandings in summer monsoon, whereas for bottlenose and delphinus, there were higher strandings in autumn intermonsoon. We don't yet have data to understand why these seasonal patterns might be coming into play, but that is something I'll be focusing on next. So we suggested that because Oman, the highest population is in the northern part and rest of the coast is less populated, there were lesser chances of strandings being detected in those regions. So places like these need active, regular surveys to glean maximum information from strandings. And the decline in Sousa proportions is concerning, and we are urging the focus of research in this region has mostly been on Arabian Sea humpback whale. But these smaller dolphins, which are more coastal, also need some focus, like research and conservation action. So we are urging people to focus more on these species and also have a better stranding response in the region. So what's next? So I've completed my second year of PhD, and I'm going to talk about what I'm going to do for the rest of it. So I would like to focus on these two aspects from our jigsaw puzzle. For mortality, since we are talking about more coastal species, I will be focusing on fisheries because fisheries has been proven to be the leading cause of mortality due to net entanglement and bycatch, which results into mortality of these species. And Oman has a high percentage of gill nets, which has been used in the region. So that is my next focus. To understand the monsoon, the drift and oceanography pattern, I'm going to study the ocean currents in the region as well. I will be fine scaling my work to one island in the central east of Oman, which is called Masira. I have a lot of data on turtle strandings in the region, and we found that there are certain locations where there were more turtles stranded over the last year, where we have set up a regular monitoring program to record strandings. So I will be looking at how the topography, wind current patterns can affect how the strandings change over years, and if there is any way that these are getting deposited in these parts of the island. I will be also trying to understand how is the fishery around this island, and if that is any way in linking to the stranding rates that we are observing. So for fisheries, I'm using this method which is developed by our lab, in which we put a tracker on the fishing vessel, and there are these Bluetooth coins which we put on the gill nets. So what happens with this is these communicate directly all the time to the tracker, but when this is submerged in water, it stops communicating. That is how I know that where and for how much time the net is submerged in water, and we get the soak time and the region of the exact fishing location from these vessels. What I'm expecting is a map which has locations of the fishing, like where the fishing is happening around the island. For oceanography, I'm using a Lagrangian particle tracking model called ocean parcels, which uses the oceanography data from the region and hindcasts the stranded animal to its probable origin of start of drift. So if we could link this to the fisheries location, we would have, we could say that, this might be happening because of bycatch, and that is something we need to focus on for conservation management in the future. So my expected outcome is a set of 3 maps, basically one layer of stranding hotspots, one showing the drift of the animals, and third of the fishing intensity around the island. If this links to the fishing intensity, great. But if it doesn't, then we might shift our focus to areas where there are more dead animals drifting from and try to understand what is happening in those regions. So I would like to acknowledge the institutes I'm working with in India and Oman who have provided me with the data and the support to carry on this work. And I would be happy to get any questions now. Yeah.
I think this might be part of your next research, but in that first chapter where you had the coastline and sort of looked at where the hot spots were and everything, did you ever correlate that to the per capita, like within that region or something like that? To see if there's more strandings or more people exist?
No, actually it's quite the opposite. So I'll show you. Okay, so the most of the population is over here. And this is a region where the population-wise, it's quite less. There were some surveys happening over here, but I'm suspecting that because of the topography, it forms like a hook or an aggregator for stranding. So when the currents are towards the shore, they kind of get deposited over here. So I'm suspecting that that is the reason why we are seeing this pattern of course.
Do you think something similar is occurring in India, off the coastline of India?
Yeah. So I'm suspecting that in India on the west coast, the strandings are getting deposited more in the monsoon regions, and same thing is happening over here in this monsoon region. So that's something I want to test. Yeah.
So for this strandings, do you have information? Are they single events or are they happening any of them in like mass events, and are they correlated with any natural or human-induced phenomenon in the region or something like that?
So I think 99% of my data is single events, so like single mortalities. The mass strandings, there have been some in both the countries, but the reason for that was never found. So there was like live stranding of like 100 dolphins going towards the shore because they were driven by orcas once or something like that. But there hasn't been any other noticeable link to any anthropogenic factors in the region. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a bit silly, but I'm curious about, this might be also part of the next chapter, but what is the relationship between having high fishing effort with stranding? Are you expecting the bycatch to be released back into the water and it can wash ashore? Is it kind of pushing the boundary of?
Yeah, some things like that. So basically, they use gill nets, which they leave in the water for a considerable amount of time. So these animals, like even turtles and the dolphins, get entangled in it. And fishermen know that catching these animals is banned. So even if the animal is dead, they kind of discard it just before taking out their nets. So and we have found a lot of turtles with nets and ropes on them or marks of the nets on the carcasses. So we are suspecting that most of these strandings are due to the bycatch, but it's hard to say until we prove kind of a link to it. So I think that's where the drifting work will come into play. Yeah.
Is anybody performing necropsies in these stranded animals when they're dead?
Yeah, in some places, yes. So in India, in recent years, there have been a lot of work. But my data is kind of only till 2017. But I've spoken to some vets and everything, so even they suspect fisheries. And something very interesting they told me about is a lot of the strandings are near the fishing ports as well. So if accidentally there are any bicod turtles or cetaceans, they kind of discard it quickly before coming into the port to avoid the risk of prosecution. So there are these other social factors as well, which might be leading to a concentration of animals in certain regions. And in Oman, there were necropsies performed as well, and they have noted evidences of fishery interaction, but they cannot say for sure that the mortality is because of that. So that's a complex bit.
Monsoons, there's both sides on India, northeast and southwest monsoon, there's a clear correlation.
Yeah.
But how are you looking at its monsoon sort of bring drift and deposit the carcasses? At the same time, they might also create like fish aggregations, therefore more fishing, therefore more accidents.
Yeah.
So it's so hard to tease apart all these. What are the factors that are actually causing the deaths? So how are you looking at? Is there any way to find out the causes, or how do you tease apart all this?
Okay, so from the knowledge that we have from the region till now, what happens is with the start of the monsoon, for example, I'm talking about Oman, when the monsoon starts, this area experiences upwelling. So a lot of fish and a lot of fishermen over there and a lot of cetaceans. So this becomes a prime region of the overlap. And so we know that during this time, the most likely reason for them to die is getting entangled in the nets because there's like a feeding frenzy over there and an overlap. So there might be other factors which might be leading to it, but the only thing so that is how the link between the fisheries and the strandings could only be through the drifts of the carcasses if it happens. There are also other causes which might be like other things which might be causing the mortalities in the region, but we don't until we have the necropsies and the other information, we cannot just put our finger on it. But we can show this general picture for now until we have a good stranding response in place for the future to testify this. Yeah.
If you look at maritime traffic or underwater noise as the driver of strandings, I know for a lot of cetaceans, they're really sensitive to like the sonar testing back in the day in the States when they were testing the submarine. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, that is like the thing of causes of strandings when you talk about it. But for my study, no. Because first of all, it's very hard to quantify because underwater noise, quantification of that, getting permissions from it's usually military and seismic activities, so people are reluctant on giving that information. Even in cases where they have found that the animals have hemorrhaged because of the sound, there has been so much research saying that we cannot conclusively point it to that. So what happens when underwater noise, for example, when a beaked whale, which is in like thousands of meters deep, and it hears a sudden boom of noise, what happens, it jerks and tries to swim away from it. So it's very indirect way, and then as it's trying to swim away from it, it hemorrhages because of the pressure differences in the water. And after many days, it ends up on the beach. So in most of these cases, it has been really hard to pinpoint that cause because this is also a behavioral reaction. But like generally people know that this is happening because of that. But the cause of this and these particular cases are very hard to study. So at least for my like PhD, I'm not focusing on that. It's just fisheries. Also, that happens in deeper waters. So I'm more focused in the coastal regions where I can see more stuff. Yeah.
First of all, it's very nice to see that you could access the stranding records even back to 70s. Yeah. So my question is, have you also looked into the population size of the and those like the small cetaceans that you mentioned, Susaplovia,
Yeah.
for the period of time that you mentioned, and try to see the relationship with the stranding intensity.
I would ideally like to do that, but unfortunately for the data I have, I don't have the abundance estimates from that timing. And also so as I said, that Susaplumbia was not a focus of research in Oman until now. So they haven't really done the population estimation of that yet. And it's kind of, I don't have enough time during my PhD to do it as well. But I kind of want to bring that focus to the species by showing these results. It's like starting off a process and contributing to the general research in the region. So, yeah. Are there any online questions? Okay.
Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.